All right, and we are live on the Gamification Revolution. Hello, everybody. I'm your host, Gabe Zickerman. So excited to see you. And I'm joined today by Greg Toppo from the beautiful suburbs of DC near Baltimore. How are you, Greg?
I'm good. I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Oh my God, so exciting to have you here. This is going to be a topic that I know lots of our Gamma family are very excited to be participating in. And hello to everybody, Sasha, David, Lori, Dutch. So good to see you all and see you all again. And those of you who are new to Gamification Revolution, welcome. You'll want to log in using one of your social media platforms. That's Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn to get online so you can ask us questions. You're going to be able to ask Greg and I any questions that may occur to you today, particularly around the subjects of gamification education. In fact, if you have a camera, you can even actually come on screen. Very few people do it, and I think it's because you're afraid that you're not cute enough, but I know you're cute enough. So be sure to press that button if you want to ask a question on camera, or just press the question button. We'll get to your questions in this half hour. And for those of you who are joining us on the repeat broadcast or watching it on demand, welcome. If you're around Thursdays, every other Thursday at 1 o'clock Eastern Time, GMT -5, you can join us live and ask your questions in real time. Okay, great. So, and before we get started, I just want to remind you guys all, if you're not already participating, join the Gamification by Design 2 Early Access Beta so you can get your feedback and input into the book before it goes live. I want to hear from every single one of you. And you're right, Dutch. Sasha is cute enough. Okay, so Greg, you've written this book called The Game Believes in You, which many people are calling, the most important or most influential book on games and education since James G's book before about the power of games in ed. And I think it's a big mantle to wear. Can you tell us in short, in a kind of short way, why is it, in your understanding, that the education industry has not adopted more games in the classroom? Why aren't we already in the fully gamified classroom?
I guess I mean there are a couple of reasons. I think the first one is that, um, as far as I can tell, education is still a very localized enterprise, and so the decisions are, as much as we like to believe that there's some big um, bureaucracy making decisions on a state or national level. I think a lot of these decisions are made much more locally, and I think. Uh, it's going to take a while for an idea like this to sort of bubble up. But I think it
And how long
will.
is a while? Hasn't it been like almost 40 years that people have been talking about putting games in the classroom?
No, absolutely. I mean, I guess the reason I think it's going to take a little longer is that my feeling is that through my research and just sort of personal experience, I would say it's only been about 5 years since most of us have had a daily experience with a video game. I would say, things like the iPhone and the iPad um, have really brought games into people's daily lives and made them kind of a naturalized part of people's lives. Um, and I think we're sort of slowly realizing their power. And I think it'll, I don't think it'll take much longer um, for this to sort of, whatever the opposite of trickle down is, maybe bubble up to the classroom. Um, I think people get it in a way that they didn't get even 5 years ago.
Well, isn't that though the kind of the sort of funny rub of all of this that you just described? Because it's like wealthy parents or parents who are able to afford, iPads or iPhones for their children and who have them from the get-go, their kids are already doing a whole bunch of game-based learning, even if that's not happening in the context of the classroom. But
Mhm.
how does that advantage or disadvantage those kids who don't have access to all of that technology? Doesn't this potentially create a huge and widening gap between the haves and the have-nots here, this powerful technology?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I think there's a possibility that it's going to get worse because, as you say, some families are more sophisticated than ever about this, and they realize that this can give their kids an advantage, and so they're taking advantage of that. I guess where I see as sort of the silver lining of this is in in the sense that there are a lot of schools adopting very low cost and in a lot of cases free games that are very, in a sense, low tech. I look at uh, things like the iCivics games, which are hugely, hugely popular. Um, and two things to me jump out. Well, actually, three things to me jump out about them as a very good model and very promising. So number one, they're free, which is always good. They're essentially foundation funded. The programmers, the studio gets paid up front, so they're taken care of. They have an incentive to develop something really wonderful. And then it's content that's just given away to schools. Um, I think that's really helpful to think about in this context. Is that a model that we can use? Um, Number two, they're very lo-fi. These are games that could have been played on a desktop computer 10 years ago. So if you're a school, you don't have to be upgrading to the latest and greatest. And number three, they're just freaking beautiful. I mean, they're really beautifully designed. Um, even though they're simple, they're really well thought out, and the content is just first first rate and really thoughtfully presented. I think those
So for
are
those people who haven't
yeah,
seen iCivics, can you just describe it and then
sure.
tell us about, because you brought up one, I know that your book is full of different actual examples of game-based
Hmm.
learning, gamified
Sure.
learning tools that you thought were really influential. Can you talk
Hmm.
about another one or others that you've seen that you think were especially effective?
Sure. I mean, do you want me to talk a little bit more about iCivics, or do you want another
Yeah, yeah.
example
Talk
too?
about iCivics for those who haven't seen it yet.
So the interesting thing to me about iCivics, and I don't really talk much about it in the book, just because I um I kind of had so many other things on my mind at the time. But iCivics is actually a really fascinating story. It was inspired by and in a large part commissioned by Sandra Day O'Connor, the retired Supreme Court justice, who realized when she retired from the court about 7, 8 years ago that Americans didn't know the first darn thing about civics or the Constitution or what judges and lawyers did. And so she went searching for a way to teach this to a lot of people with sort of no fuss. And what she eventually landed on, with the help of folks like Connie Yallett MacArthur and Jim G, actually, it was an approach to this through games. And so the studio in Madison, Wisconsin, Filament Games has created, I think there are now 20 iCivics games, and they're played by millions and millions of kids every year. Really, really smart
Are they
games.
effective at teaching?
They're really effective, actually. And if you ask the users, I mean, they've got sort of a rabid user base. I'm actually going to be speaking with them later this summer. I mean, the teachers who use them are incredibly dedicated to them. It's really fun to watch and really kind of exciting to see, how much kids get out of these games. Another example, I mean, I talk about lots and lots of different examples um, in the book. I guess if I had to pick one that I thought really sort of encapsulated kind of the do-it-yourself nature of this, and I think that's a kind of an exciting piece of this, is a teacher that I met in Minnesota who developed a game um, based on he based the sort of the game piece of it on fantasy football, and what it was a way to get kids interested in learning about world affairs. What he would do is invite the players to pick essentially a fantasy team of three countries, could be totally unrelated, and they would be judged week to week on their ability to basically make news, make international news. So what it did was I mean, essentially gamified reading the newspaper. It encouraged students to think about, you know, which countries were going to be in the news, what was happening. And so eventually what the game did was really got kids excited about following the news. And of course, we were talking before this about paper versus digital. These kids eventually started their own Facebook feed, started their own discussion group. And as this teacher says, he loved it because he became, in a way, kind of unimportant in this process. He was able to step back and just watch them discuss it on their own. And that's,
I want to
the,
come
the
back.
teachers love that idea.
I,
Sorry.
I want to come back to the paper versus digital. No, I think it's very interesting because actually that's like a really popular topic, and I know people are going to want to talk about it. But Lori asked a question about the age of the kids who are involved, and I want to broaden that question. I
Sure.
think that question was in reference to iCivics, but I want to broaden that question and say, what do we know about the different kind of phases of childhood education and the influence or impact or potential for games at those different levels? What did you see in your research?
I mean, my research, I actually saw it run the gamut. I mean, in the introduction, I talk about a program called ST Math, which is, having some real success with even very young kids. And then it goes all the way up to high school and even beyond in college. I didn't really talk about higher ed in the book. But I mean, essentially what we know is that it can work at any age, and it is working at any age. Um, a lot of
Are
the
there
really
unique
exciting,
considerations? Like when we're talking about, for example, doing kindergarten level stuff or we're doing, 12th grade stuff, are there some
sure.
patterns or considerations that apply there specifically to the gamified education piece?
I mean, it's got obviously got to be developmentally appropriate. Um, but I think beyond that, the sky's the limit. I mean, you can do all kinds of really amazing things once you have in hand, once you understand what a 4-year-old can do versus a 16-year-old. I talk in the book about another app that probably a lot of your viewers are familiar with, Dragonbox. I don't
Mhm.
know. I don't know if you can take a poll and see if, who knows about Dragonbox, but this is an iPad app that's really popular, and essentially what it has become is kind of an interesting way for parents to help their kids think algebraically. Um, and when I say kids, I mean kids as young as 4 years old. In the book, I talk about how it works, and I can describe it briefly if you want. But essentially, it starts with pictures, and you're moving around pictures of animals um, on one side of the board or another. And what you realize after just a little while is that you are, in a sense, doing sort of a proto-algebra with all these symbols. And eventually, the symbols, the animals, turn to X's and Y's and ones and twos and negative threes. And you realize that this system you've been working in is two sides of an algebra problem. And the one side, you're always trying to isolate the character on the one side, and that turns out to be X. So X equals what have you. And by the end of this game, you go 100 levels and you're solving quite a, a, a pretty advanced algebra problem. And you could be a preschooler doing this because it takes you so
Well,
seamlessly through it.
so, but there seems to be also like this added, I feel like there's some added conflict there when we're talking about like very young kids, because isn't
Mhm.
there all this, I know from parents, I know from my sister who has young children, my nephews, and from other friends of mine who have pretty young children, all this conflict about screen time and the
Yeah.
kind of, brain training that occurs with young kids and screen time. How
Mhm.
is that currently making its way through the discussion of gamification in early childhood?
I actually think, I don't follow this on a daily basis, but what I do know is this, that the idea of screen time is becoming, if you will, less relevant. And it's because when we talked about screen time, I think 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, it was mostly a certain kind of thing. It was either, let's say, TV on the one hand, or or a movie or a game. And the game might have been interactive, might have been interesting and exciting. Um, Now I think, and you can even ask some pediatricians about this. I think the idea that screen time has to be limited, I think they still feel that's an important thing to think about. But if you're sitting with your mom, and let's say you're 3 or 4 years old, and you're sitting with your mom on her lap, and you've got the iPad, and you're reading an interactive book, or you're doing a game, or you're playing a game, or you're doing something where there's a lot going on between you and the parent and the device, I would say that's a different kind of screen time. And
Right.
I think a lot of pediatricians would agree. Which is not to say, you can have the screen on 24/7. I just think there's some different considerations. And
Well, isn't
it's
that
just,
one of the one of
Sorry,
the
go ahead.
dynamics that drives no, no, one of the dynamics that seems to drive the discussion of gamification education is some people have this vision that you're just going to be able to sit the kids down in front of the game, right, and just like
Yeah,
kind of let them play for an hour, and then maybe do some follow up or whatever at the end.
right.
And is that really the method that produces the best results in your experience? Are we really heading towards a kind of matrix-like education system where all the kids are going to just sit in front of a box, do that all day long, and then periodically come up and drink a juice box and then go back to doing that?
you, thankfully, no. I did see something that was similar to this when I visited one of the rocket ship schools in the Bay Area, and but I will say to their credit, they're really thoughtful about this and they're really thinking hard about whether that works. Um, if you read the chapter where I talk about rocket ship, um, what I describe is something they called the learning lab, which was a basically kind of a big all-purpose room that they divided into sections with sort of hand-painted plywood, and there were about 130, 140 desktop computers in there. Excuse me, and kids would come in class by class and just occupy certain area of the room and put their headphones on and get to work. And it was really quite remarkable. I mean, and these were elementary schoolers, and there was a sort of hush around the room. Um, Nobody really interacting with anybody, nobody really having a discussion. It was just kids getting their stuff done. Um, and at
You
first
sound
blush, you think,
inspired by that. Yeah.
well, at first blush, you think, oh my God, this is terrible. I would never want this to happen. And then you sit down. I mean, the thing that got me interested in this was that and it got me interested in a lot of things in this world. When you scratch beneath the surface, I think is what's happening is different than what it seems like. So what I describe in the book is that I just basically sat down. I picked a random kid, sat down behind him, watched him play this game. As it turned out, it was a game called ST Math, which a lot of people were excited about. Um, and just watched him work through the levels for 5, 10, 15 minutes. And what I realized was that what was happening in this kid's head um, wasn't mindless. It wasn't just cranking through. I mean, he was really giving thought to the solutions. He was really working at a very high level. I mean, the way I described it, when I met one of the founders of Rocket Ship, I said, I think you guys have figured out how to leave that no child behind. Like, this was the kid that we have been focusing on for so long. And the thing we've been trying to do for so long is get this kid's basic level of achievement, the level of work he does, to a higher level. And I mean, quite frankly, the kind of math this kid who was fourth grader was doing was something that I don't know about you, but I never did that in fourth grade. Um, and I thought that was
Well,
really, sorry, go ahead.
no, no. So it kind of begs an interesting question, right? Which Dutch had asked a little bit earlier.
Yeah,
And I know this is outside the scope of your book, The Game Believes in You, but kind of something for you to think about because you deeply dived on this. So all of this sounds amazing. So kids
yeah,
go to rocket ship school. They work in these amazing educational games where they're like pushed forward and the game helps them achieve these incredible levels of achievement and they're all like self-directed and the teachers are working with them and all that. And then they get to the university system,
yeah,
which looks not much different from the way that it did in 1670 or
yeah,
whenever it was first founded.
yeah.
How is this preparing kids for the reality of life outside of, so that the opposite end of the spectrum, if we go
Sure.
all the way in this direction,
I guess,
what are some of the considerations?
I mean, I guess I would never say that this is the only math a kid is going to do in their day. Okay. This is just a chunk of it. And then nothing replaces discussion, talking with your teachers and your classmates about what you're doing, thinking about things in a group, working essentially, with your hands. I mean, the thing that got me excited about what I saw was that it just raised the basic level of the work. Where you go from there, I think, is really kind of the key to this. You're right. You can't just kind of work on a machine for 12 years and then be expected to be able to discuss things at a deep level. And that's not what that's not what this was for. The way it was described to me is that, there are certain things, and I think Rocket Ship has been, among other people, have been thinking a lot about this. There are certain things that a machine does well, that a computer does well, and there are certain things that a human does well, teachers do well. And let's just get straight on those things. Um, and let's rely on the machines to do the things machines do well. I'll tell a very silly story, just related to my profession. A couple of weeks ago, there was this story about how the Associated Press, which is where I used to work, is going to be outsourcing certain kinds of stories, like earnings stories and sports stories, to robots. and
Right.
and people were freaked out. They were totally saying, oh my God, it's the end of journalism as we know it. The machines are going to take over. Well, having been a journalist who had to write those stories, had to write the
You were a
quarterly earnings
robot.
reports, I was the robot. And I had to, I mean, when I was at the AP, I had to write minor league baseball stories off of a box score. So what I would say is let the machines have that stuff. I mean, if I need to teach my kid, the multiples of 9, let the machines do that. And let's raise the level of the classroom discussion higher. And I think that's something that gets lost.
So if we go a slightly different tack there, so I think
Yeah.
probably we'll get not a ton of pushback. Certainly here, you won't get a ton of pushback for the idea of teaching, math with games. I think there's often been a kind of really good alignment and fewer less tension about that. Can you tell us
Mhm.
about softer skills and gamification? So, a question from Christopher, Dr. Vogelman, who's there, asking about socialization, and I want to broaden this and say, what did you see in the connection between games and gamification in the classroom and soft skills not related to math? Any bright spots?
I mean, what I saw a lot of times was that, and the thing I would refer to was, excuse me, the one of the classrooms I spent a lot of time in was actually up near where you guys are in New York. I spent a lot of time in an after-school program where a librarian who then became a humanities teacher was using World of Warcraft to teach English skills, humanities. Kind of her big idea was that she wanted to teach the hero's journey through a game. And
Hmm.
what I saw was a lot of soft skills. I mean, I saw the game generating some real discussions among the players, um, very informally, actually. Um, this after school compute basically it was an after school computer club really forged some very close friendships and among kids who you wouldn't ordinarily think would be friends, high schoolers and middle schoolers, special ed
Right.
kids and advanced kids. So, I mean, I don't know if you want to call that soft skills, but um, I mean, they the work they were getting done in the game translated into their um, their relationships because you know in a way nobody really cares who you are in the game if you can't help the next guy, right? If you can't be helpful, if you can't help solve problems, then that was the currency, if you will, in this group. How helpful is Gabe? Well, if Gabe is really helpful and he knows a lot, you know, he's going to be an important person. Not so much, what kind of shoes does he wear?
I think that raises a kind of very specific and interesting, observation I've had, and kind of related to this question from Lori. So thanks for that question, Lori, about the design process and the
Yeah.
instructional design process for games. So one thing that I've seen is I've seen this sort of bifurcation. There are two different ways to use games in a classroom.
Yeah.
Broadly, one is games specifically designed for educational purposes, so ones which are explicitly made, like ST Math, specifically made to
Right.
teach stuff, right? iCivics.
Right.
And then repurposing games which may or may not, and gamified processes which may or may not have been originally designed to teach anything, but using those as as a tool against which a teacher teaches. Can you speak a little bit to those two schools of thought and what you're observing now in terms of how people are using those different things and what are the challenges on both sides?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's value in both of those approaches. I mean, obviously, the game that's designed to teach a certain set of content or certain skills has got sort of more of like a laser-like focus. I mean, that's obviously going to be more, I guess, I mean, efficiency is kind of a dirty word in some ways, but it's going to be more efficient, um, and it's going to enable you to get to the heart of what you want to teach and then assess it more, sort of quickly and without fuss. I guess, um, you know, I see the value in the other way of doing things. Um, it, to me, it just takes, I mean, in a way, it takes like a smarter teacher to figure out
Right.
how to kind of bend the game's will, which is not to say that it can't happen. It just takes someone who understands the game a little bit better and who understands how it can apply to what you want to do in school. I mean, I think there's value,
That's
like I said, in both of them. Sorry. Go ahead.
But doesn't that beg a kind of interesting question, right? Which is, if games are going to rise as a tool or a mechanism in the classroom, doesn't this start to demand a different kind of teacher skill set? What are some of the implications for teaching with games that are new and different,
Yeah,
and how, if at all, are people responding to that challenge?
yeah. I mean, I can't say how people in general are responding to that challenge, but I can say how people who I've talked to have responded to that challenge. I mean, people who I interviewed for the book. Um, I think on the one hand, it takes a teacher who is willing to sort of give up a little bit of control, and let the learning unfold in a different way, let's say. Um, and on the other hand, I think it takes a teacher um, who is willing to, and this is kind of, in a way, it's a sort of a control question too, who's willing to um, let students sort of come up with solutions, if you will, and be okay with that. I think it takes, I don't think it takes any more knowledge of your, more or less knowledge of, what the actual content is. We're always going to need that. I think the kind of teacher that games are going to require is, um, I think a teacher who maybe has more of like an open mind about how you get from point A to point B. Um,
So, is anyone teaching teachers how to teach with games?
anyone teaching teachers how to teach a game? Yeah, I mean, what I would point to would be some of the work that folks like the Institute of Play are doing in New York. So these are the folks who opened the Quest to Learn school and who have opened the second one in Chicago as well. I mean, one of the things they're finding is that, so they spent the first, um, I would say maybe 4 years really focusing on their own teachers and helping them understand. And these are people who didn't necessarily have any great like love of games or interest in games. So they taught them how to use games and think about games to get content across. But now what they're doing, and that's a small group of people. That's only maybe a dozen people in all, at that school. So now what they're doing is they're taking those ideas and they're training teachers in other schools. And I think that's in a way where the potential for this really, um, it has the potential to sort of spread exponentially. They're using game design to help teachers think about, how do you take a game and use it to teach content you already need to teach.
Hasn't there been some kind of like mild controversy about Quest to Learn in a sense? Because I've seen these stats come back that they haven't necessarily improved like performance.
Yeah,
And so one of the questions is at some point, and there's a spirited discussion going on in the chat right now here about measurement and
yeah,
outcomes and efficacy. And you use the word efficiency,
yeah.
which I think is telling that you're uncomfortable using that word in this context a little bit. I think how close are we to real accountability for the use of games in education? Do we have evidence that says gamified education in a rigorous, measured way is improving outcomes? Or are we still at the stage now where we're kind of talking about, that we think it's going to be better?
Yeah. I mean, I think the people who have gotten serious about it and who are serious about the measurement are seeing results. I talk in the book about DC public schools, Washington DC. They like the results they're seeing, because the places that are using things like ST Math, they're seeing their proficiency rates go up, um, and would be the first ones to say, this is something that um, has really started to show some serious results. I mean, it's not the only math kids do. I want to make sure about that. I mean, it's not replacing, the teacher standing up in front of the class. I mean,
Why
it's
not?
well, I mean, that's a good question. Why not? I mean, I don't know. I don't know specifically why it hasn't. Um, I mean, I would say that they feel like at this point it's just another input for kids. It's an input that complements what the teacher is doing. I mean, it's not just review, it's not just drill and practice. But I think at this point they're comfortable with having both of those things happen, and having the teacher on the one hand teach, and the game on the other hand teach. Maybe even different things altogether, but they're complementary. So, but I
One
mean,
of
to your larger question though, I
yeah,
mean, if
yeah,
I can kind of take another stab at it, I
sure,
mean,
yeah.
I mean, I, I don't think we have like an overall uh, rating on this. I don't think anybody's really attempted that yet. But what I do see is that the places that have tried it, and places that have tried it with real seriousness and rigor, are starting to see the results. And you talked about Quest to Learn and how there's sort of the spirited discussion. I mean, they had a couple of years where it was a tricky place to work and a tricky place to be a student. But I think they're starting to see. I think they've turned a corner. I think they're seeing the kinds of indicators that we want in a school are really improving. I mean,
Well,
satisfaction and parent satisfaction and test scores are going up. So anyway,
that's great. I'm
just to
glad.
leave it at
I'm
that.
really glad
I
to
mean,
hear that.
yeah,
I tend to be of the opinion whenever I talk to educators about the subject of gamification in the classroom and parents, I usually start from a place of saying this, there is no one magic ring that's
yeah,
going to
exactly.
solve all the varied problems with education. That every technology wave tends to start with that. Like people get up and they say, "We have the total solution. It's iPads in the classroom, and
Yeah,
everything will be solved with iPads in the classroom." Right? And it's like
yeah,
it's not all going to be solved by gamification. There's some stuff that it's going to solve. And an interesting kind of discussion has been going on, lots of, really poignant kind of stories from people in the chat. But I just want to kind of distill it down and ask you a question.
yeah.
Separate from the games, and a question from Dr. Vogelman, from Christopher, about using leaderboards and comparison and win conditions and competition in the spirit of games and gamification in the classroom. So there's a lot of theories about the use of comparative metrics and stats and
Right.
whether people should be pushed or not, whether everyone should receive an achievement trophy or not, right? There's a lot of heuristic dialogue about that all kids are spoiled and everyone gets a trophy, and a lot of data about overcompensation, overjustification, and the
Right.
and the strategy. What have you observed in this dialogue about the role of games and gamification in the classroom and these questions? Where are we at right now in the discussion about how to reward, how to incentivize, and how to recognize performance, and what's different in the gamified classroom?
I mean, to me, I guess if I could distill it down to like one word, I would say that it's a fairer system. It's more fair than the
Okay.
system we already have. There's a more the places that I went and the classrooms that I visited, um, the systems that I observed, where there were things like leaderboards, um, they were just fairer places, and they were, in a sense, more of a meritocracy because I think the focus was um, on the one hand, more of a personal best, um, and on the other hand, teamwork. Um, Games are great for getting people motivated, and if you really wanted to, you could have people competing against one another and really, kind of a battle to the death. But what I saw more often than not was that the system was designed to, in a sense, force kids to collaborate, force kids to help one another. Um, and which is not, it didn't take anything away from kids achieving and achieving their personal best. It just was a different orientation. And so and that's kind of the biggest reason why I say it was fair. Um, it, it, it came from a different place. It wasn't just what have you done and can we put it on the wall? It was, let's think a little bit more deeply about what you can do. And before it goes on the wall, let's think about, what went into it and what, how you got there in a way. Um,
So,
anyway, I mean,
so that's
I, it's a hard thing to kind of distill, but I think in a sense, it's a more thoughtful way of laying out what people have achieved. And that's
well,
really
and I think
exciting.
that's very. So I think that's very interesting, right? I think this deeper thought, and I want to kind of close with one question for you. And I know that I know that Sasha, one of our regular viewers, is going to be disappointed that he left. He had to run
Okay.
before we got a chance to ask this question. So across the arc of kind of educational games, I talk about it a lot. I feel like there was this big gap between where in the world is Carmen San Diego,
Hmm.
the last like kind of great super hit in that category,
Yeah.
um, and recently, when it seems like there's been a flurry of activity and investment in the private sector in
Yeah.
building, games for the classroom, suddenly that now there's an economic model,
Yeah.
potentially. Can you talk a little bit about what's changed from those kind of dark, terrible, like, there's not a lot of stuff out there, 2000s to now that's really unlocked the potential. Now there's so much stuff going on.
That's a really big question. I mean, on the one hand, I think the technology is easier to work with. I think you um, I wouldn't say anybody can be a game designer, but I think game design is much more accessible to a lot more people. I think you had a generation of people growing up with games like Carmen San Diego or the Oregon Trail who understood what was going on in games like that. And so, it wasn't a novelty to them. They could start from
Right.
that place of, okay, I can teach this content with this kind of tool. Um, I mean, the devices, I think, are a piece of it, not a very big piece of it. I think the advent of things like the iPad have been really important. But I guess maybe to me the key is that we've had let's just forget education for a second. Let's just talk about the kind of the renaissance of game design in the past 10 years. We've had really amazing things happen in that world. And what I think is happening is so many of those people are becoming parents. And um, they are looking at what they're doing in their day job, and then they come home and their kids are sitting there, wanting to have some kind of interaction. And I think they kind of the light bulb goes on, and they realize, I can use these skills to a different end. I think that's what a lot of what's happening. A lot of the game designers I talk to, um, they had this aha moment when they became parents, and
I,
that's thrilling. I mean,
I think that's very heartening, and there's a whole bunch of other questions that people come to, but we're out of
yeah,
time. We've gone over, but it's such a fascinating conversation, and I hope Greg Toppo, that we can have you back, maybe have you come in and talk to us all at G Summit at our next event. Everyone, Greg's book, The Game Believes in You, is available at Amazon and on other websites. You can go to gamebelieves.com to find out more and order your copy. And you can also follow Greg on Twitter at gtoppo. That's GTOPPO. Greg Toppo, thank you so much for being with us.
thank you. It's been great. Take care.
And thanks everybody for joining us here on the Gamification Revolution. I'm your host, Gabe Zickerman. You can follow me on Twitter at GZicherm, GZICHERM. We'll be back again in 2 weeks' time with another conversation with leading thinkers in the subject of gamification and engagement. In the meantime, everybody, keep having fun, and we'll see you soon.